Welcome back from your break, everybody. We're going to get started with our second session of the day, which is going to be Research Roundtable. Before we begin, there was a question in the chat about additional resources or documentaries covering some of the material that Dr. Avila presented on. And I saw several people shared some really great resources in the chat. I also just wanted to highlight that the event webpage for this workshop, which JC just put in the chat, has a couple additional documentaries, as well as some other written materials that you can check out as well. So our first session was really about conveying the historical role that transportation decisions have had in creating and perpetuating racial inequities and the lasting harm that some of those decisions have had. I think Dr. Avila really demonstrated that with some really powerful images. In this next session, we're going to hear presentations from 3 researchers about contemporary policies and processes and how they might continue to perpetuate some of those same inequities or hopefully be reshaped to achieve more equitable outcomes. So we're hoping that these presentations will help set the stage for our discussion groups coming up in the next session. The presentations are going to last about an hour, so we'll have 3 20-minute presentations, and then we'll use the remaining time for Q&A. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box as we go through the presentations. And then once we get to that Q&A session, you should also feel free to use the raise hand feature that you'll find on your Zoom toolbar if you'd rather ask your question verbally. We'll make sure that we're monitoring that. So let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Dr. Dana Roengold is a research assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Vermont. And prior to that, did a lot of great work here at UC Davis. So we're happy to virtually welcome her back. So Dr. Roengold, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, you can take it away.
All right, thank you. Let's see. All right, can you see the screen right now?
Yes, looks good.
Great. Great. Well, thanks a lot, Mike and JC. And I'm actually really, I'm thrilled to be able to join you and to talk about some of my work. And I'm also really thrilled to be able to follow on the great intro that you guys set up. And Dr. Avila's presentation was a great kind of provided the historical context that I think is really important for these conversations so that we can have that in mind as we think about how to move forward. So today, what I'm going to talk about is some work that I recently did with colleagues on thinking about decision-making processes in equity in transportation. And so I'm going to present on a paper entitled From Transportation Equity to Transportation Justice Within, Through, and Beyond the State. So I should first acknowledge my colleagues who worked on this as well, Alex Karner, Jonathan London at UC Davis, and Kevin Manna. And so the idea behind this work, it kind of started with some questions that we had about how the terms equity and justice have been used interchangeably. And we started to dig deeper and into that question and to think about the types of strategies that different groups use, the type of language that different groups use, and how those affect the achievement of equity and justice in transportation decision-making. So first, I just want to kind of lay out equity as a term that we see a lot in sort of public decision-making spheres, so with state actors. And by state, I don't mean the state of California, I just mean state as in the government, as capital state. And so planners and engineers and decision makers often use the term equity. On the other hand, we often see nonprofit organizations and advocates using the term justice. And they do have a little bit of a different meaning. And I think that the historical context that Eric laid out is really going to help explain that difference pretty easily. And so those different terms also kind of feed into the different strategies that those two kind of inside decision makers and outside advocacy groups tend to use, not always, in transportation decision making. And then I want to use those insights to think about how justice perspectives and also some agency best practices can help us think about some promising directions for equity and justice achievement in transportation. So first, transportation equity, we often think of quantitative equity analysis. So basically, in any kind of transportation decision context, we evaluate first whether inequities exist, and we focus on race, ethnicity, and income often in that environment. Public involvement is an important part of that process. And so this is a movement from the past, as Eric was saying, back then it was like in the late 30s and in the 60s, it was sort of pushing through and not really wanting to listen to what people say. We've come a long way since then. There is an important public involvement process. So that's kind of heartening. Generally speaking, this type of equity analysis is related to adherence with regulatory requirements and guidelines, and it's often seeking a reform. So, changes in a project or plan that can kind of mitigate any perception of future inequities that would result. On the other hand, transportation justice is rooted in these sort of outside social movements. So it's rooted in groups that have historically been outside of the decision-making process and have had to learn to use different types of tools to influence the process. So movements like the civil rights movement, environmental justice, and also mobility justice movements that are sort of now and sort of feeding into this transportation justice movement. The view in this, and I don't want to generalize and say everyone has the same view, but generally speaking, the contrast with equity, the equity framework is that the view is that the current system heavily disadvantages non-drivers. So it's not just about, it is about people of color, Black people, Latinx people, low-income people, but it's also about non-drivers. Also, some of the disadvantages are not just about environmental burdens and access to opportunities, they're about things like exposure to violence and police violence. The justice movement seeks to transform social structures rather than to incrementally or reform them. And a really important part of that is thinking about the causes of inequities. So the history and the context and the historical and current structures of power and capital that result in racial inequities. Generally speaking, the desired state is that everyone would have access to transportation decision-making and to the transportation resources that they need to lead a meaningful life. So we have these two different kind of frameworks, this equity framework and this justice framework. But at the end of the day, the way that transportation decisions happen, they both kind of have to appeal to the state, the sort of state with a capital S. So where does that leave the sort of the justice piece, the advocates, when the type of change that they want requires them to go through the state? So reflecting on that kind of backdrop for the approaches of these different groups, we started to lay out state-centric and society-centric approaches to achieving equity or justice. And so generally speaking, the sort of equity framework and the state actors tend to go for state-centric type approaches, and advocates and justice advocates tend to go for society-centric. And by society-centric, I mean sort of the people on the ground, and by state-centric, I mean the governance structure. So we're all part of the same world, but we're sort of two different levels, really. So as I said, nearly all approaches do have to flow through the state at some point, but some of them kind of start with society and move to the state, or they start with the state and move to society, or there's more emphasis on the sort of society-centric piece. So I'll start with just kind of an overview of these state-centric approaches. They generally focus on the distribution of outcomes. So that might be environmental harms, it might be access to opportunities, and they're often thinking about, are those outcomes equitable, for whom, are they equitable, and how is equity defined? And as I said earlier, they're informed by public engagement, and they also generally rely on state-led data and analysis. So think, equity performance measurement and travel demand model outputs. And that's sort of generally how we go about this evaluation of equity using these traditional state-centric approaches. So in this work, we looked a lot at environmental justice literature and research, which is really based on what's happening in social movements. And so what we see is that the state is often viewed as an unreliable partner or an adversary. And I think that, when you take into account the history that Dr. Avila was talking about, you can see why that might be the case. So people have a very real awareness of the state's historic role in perpetuating injustices through redlining and other processes as well, slavery, voter suppression. And so that feeling and that mistrust come into play in a modern transportation equity analysis setting. So there is, and I should say too, for a while I did work, consulting work with nonprofits, a lot of equity-oriented nonprofits, and they often perceive public participation processes as an agency sort of going through the motions. So perhaps they are invited to the table kind of late in the game when the alternatives have already been set or the needs have already been identified. Or perhaps when they're invited to the table, they only get 2 minutes to speak and they feel like that's not enough time to really say what they want to say, or that nobody's really listening. There's also a perception that state-led analyses can miss critical issues and also overlook important sources of information. So, for example, they might focus on, whether they might focus on travel mode without thinking about the impact of policing on how people travel. There's also a perception that the state isn't invested in actually solving these injustices, because to do so would be really disruptive to current political and economic systems. So there's this perception basically that the state is not working to achieve transformative change. They're working to make small changes, to make incremental changes, but that it's not going to achieve the scale of change that justice advocates are looking for. So because of that, society-centric approaches often don't start with the state, although they may work through the state. So they might start with advocates and community-based organizations, and there's often an emphasis on the root causes of injustice, as I was talking about. And so part of addressing the root causes of injustice has to do with having a fair decision-making process, because part of the root causes of injustice are that affected people weren't always at the table. I mean, I think, again, Dr. Avila's presentation was a perfect example of that. And there's also this idea that, it's really important to recognize diverse sources of knowledge. So we may have a data set that tells us one thing is happening, but when you ask people on the ground, they're talking about something else completely that we're not even measuring. And then again, there's more of an emphasis on transformational change rather than reform with these society-centric approaches. So I'm going to lay out kind of a spectrum of strategies from this state-centric end to the society-centric end. And it's not, I kind of lay it out as a clean line because it helps us learn and it helps us think about how things are. But in reality, things move along the line, and some processes pull from different pieces of the line. But I think it's a helpful way to think about things and to think about where we are and where we could be when we're working on issues related to equity and justice. So first, as I mentioned, at the state-centric end of the spectrum is agency-led analysis. And this is like performance-based planning, where we do run a travel demand model and we look at indicators and how something performs with equity, and then we kind of tweak the system to fix any inequities that may arise. Alongside that agency analysis, we do have traditional public engagement. And this is what we were talking about as being progress from the days of freeway building in the mid 19th century, mid 19th century. I always mess those up. So traditional public engagement is things like public notice, public hearings and meetings, written comments, and there's often documented responses to that kind of engagement. And this is closer to the society end of the spectrum because we've now invited non-decision makers kind of into the room to influence decision. We can also go further along the spectrum to think about conflict resolution. So a lot of times that adversarial relationship that I mentioned can result in litigation or administrative complaints. And so at that point, the sort of society end and the state end are both at the table, and someone else is making a decision about how they're going to move forward. And it might be a state actor making the decision, so the courts, or it might be a neutral arbiter, so someone from the community or a neutral facilitator. And there can also be something called a community benefit agreement, where there's a formal agreement between an agency and the community, where the agency agrees to deliver certain benefits in exchange for the community's support on a project or a plan. As we move further along the spectrum, we get to participatory budgeting. And this one is important because this is where we're talking about how we actually make spending decisions. And obviously, a big influence on the transportation systems that we see is how we invest our money. So with participatory budgeting, the main idea is that there's a budget share that's allocated to the needs identified by residents. And the residents themselves are involved in determining how the money is spent and also the rules for deciding how the money is spent. So the sort of process rules within that. It's really important that this process includes outreach to marginalized groups. So you have to have affected people at the table, including people who traditionally are not at the table. There can be funds for staff time and assistance to support this process. The budget should be flexible, so it shouldn't be about specific project types because those may or may not conform to the needs that the residents are talking about. And it can include support for community involvement as well as tracking progress toward community goals. As we go further along the spectrum, we get to community-led analysis. So in some ways, this is kind of similar to agency-led analysis in terms of the methods that could be used, but they don't have to be the same methods. And the difference is that it's led by community leaders, or at least in collaboration with community leaders. So in this type of analysis, the scope and the assumptions and the needs can be determined by the community. The data collection and analysis can occur from community leaders or from their partners. They might have university partners or agency partners that are supporting the work. You can have community designed alternatives. Sometimes this type of analysis can actually happen as part of a traditional public engagement process where you have public meetings that include scenario planning or visioning tools. And then, as I said, it can include partnerships. Those partnerships might be analytical partnerships or they could be funding partnerships. So it could be that an agency sort of funds a community-led analysis. And they're kind of great examples of this type of analysis are health impact assessments that we see a lot where community members are really driving the process, even though they may have inside the community experts or academic partners that sort of lead the process or agency partners. And then on the full society-centric end of the spectrum, we have what we traditionally think of, I think, as society-centric approaches, which are things like protests and sit-ins that we've been seeing a lot recently. And so those also play an important part. And it may be that, something starts out as community organizing and then it moves over to an agency-led analysis. So a community might identify a need and they might go to the agency and say, hey, we really want you to start a process to think about this need. So as I said, we have this full spectrum. Things can kind of move around. Pieces can be combined. It's not as clean as this, but this is maybe a helpful way to think about it. But I don't want to say that, we should just move completely over to society end and then all of our problems will be solved. That's not necessarily true. So there is a lot of promise in these society-centric strategies in achieving transformative change. And we have seen some examples where it looks like we're getting closer to that I'll talk about in a moment. And certainly at least having a goal of transformative change is going to get you closer to achieving it. But at the same time, there can be a lot of barriers to success. So you have to really have a lot of people involved, a lot of people that are affected and are bringing, an important perspective to the table. But in order to get those people involved, there has to be a perception that their involvement matters. So a favorable opportunity structure. And by that, I just mean that if people feel like I'm going to get involved and I'm going to work really hard and I'm going to spend a lot of time on this and nothing's going to happen, then they're not going to want to get involved. So that equation kind of has to be shifted. There have to be sufficient resources for the leaders in the community. So if they're community-based organizations that are helping to organize people and really putting in the time to help people understand what's happening and to bring them out, then they have to have appropriate resources to do that. But as I said, it's not a panacea. There is there's a tension between playing this inside game and this outside game. So if community members start in the society-centric process outside of what an agency is doing, and they don't want to join what the agency is doing, then they risk sort of alienating themselves, and people will marginalize them and say, hey, you didn't come to this process. But at the same time, if they do participate, they risk a tokenistic participation. So it may be that they get invited to the table, but then they don't feel like they're listened to. But at the end of the day, an agency can say, well, we invited them to the table, and so that was enough. We did what we needed to do. Or they might even be invited to a different table. So maybe there's a separate committee for the equity representatives, and there's a separate committee for the technical representatives. So then the chance for the equity representatives to really influence what's happening in the technical committee may be quite low, or lower than it would be otherwise. And then another risk is that, justice groups are not a monolith, just as the state is not a monolith. And I know that state actors are doing lots of different things, and I know Caltrans is doing lots of different things, and probably many of the things that I'm talking about today. At the same time, justice groups are not a monolith, and they don't all want the same things. So some of them may want something that's in conflict with other justice groups, or you may have other groups at the table, of course, other types of stakeholders, small business owners, or the labor movement, or NIMBYism, that are sort of at the table as well. So obviously it can't all just be kind of handed over and then everything is fixed necessarily. But at the same time, there are some hybrid approaches that appear to be pretty promising that I'll talk about now. So I'm just going to give two quick examples. This one is from my postdoc work at UC Davis. So this was in 2012, and it was when Fresno County Council of Governments was putting together their regional transportation plan, which was their first sustainable community strategy. And I was working at the UC Davis Center for Regional Change, and we partnered with a coalition of equity-oriented advocates in Fresno County, and they had identified transportation needs through a sort of a community process, and they used that insight to set up a health impact assessment. And so we did a lot of the analysis for the health impact assessment. And what they were interested in looking at was basically, are people able to access jobs with transit in disadvantaged unincorporated areas? So there are some kind of small unincorporated areas outside of Fresno where there's very little transit service, and people are very reliant on transit because they don't have cars. And so that was something that the community had identified as very limiting. So we did the analysis. And interestingly, when you do a traditional equity analysis and you look at the dimensions of race and income, everything looks pretty equitable in this sustainable community strategy plan that was put forth. But when you look at it from the lens of these unincorporated areas, which were largely farm worker communities, things look pretty bad. They really did not have the type of access that other similarly situated communities did have. So that was kind of an important insight that came from a community-led analysis that wouldn't ordinarily come out of an agency-led analysis because they were asking different questions. These groups also did a lot of community organizing. They were reaching out to decision makers. They were showing up at meetings. And at the end of the day, they had a win, which was that the Fresno Council of Governments established a mini grant program to support the public involvement of advocacy organizations and schools during the next RTP update. So that was kind of an important sort of allocation of funds to that effort to provide that input into the process. And then the next win I want to mention was in the Bay Area. So this was a similar process, actually. It was the Regional Transportation Plan in the Bay Area in 2012. And there was another coalition of advocates called the Six Wins Coalition that was made up of affordable housing, public health, transportation justice, anti-displacement, and economic opportunity organizations. And so what they did was they came to the table during the Metropolitan Transportation Commission's Regional Transportation Plan, EIR planning. They have all these meetings and they have all this process. And they came to the table and they said, hey, we want you to look at a different scenario. We've come up with an equity scenario, and we want you to look at this scenario. And so the agency did. So this was kind of a combination of a community-led analysis where they came up with a scenario and they gave it to the agency. The agency had an analysis, and it turned out that this equity scenario outperformed the agency's plan. At the same time, this group was doing lots of organizing, getting people to meetings, identifying champions. And at the end of the day, this sort of combined effort resulted in some key wins. So the organizations got anti-displacement protections, they got more operating funds for transit, and then they also got some cap and trade revenues allocated to disadvantaged communities. So I do want to just talk, I realize I'm talking to Caltrans, and so you guys are in a great position to be doing this work, and I think you already are doing some of this work. But I just want to sort of think about the progress we've made and also try to push things a little bit further. So a lot of the insights here on this slide, which I tried to put together as a sort of a idea list for people on this webinar, but a lot of these ideas came from agency best practices. So these are things that are happening that federal agencies are saying are the right thing to be doing. So the first list is just some advanced public engagement practices. And these include things like receiving training from community members about community engagement and justice concerns. So this workshop right now, I think, has been fantastic so far, and I'm really excited to see what's next. But I could imagine a subsequent training that really involves community members and community-based organizations coming out and leading the training rather than academics, as much as I love the academic perspective. There's also a lot of other work to be done, maintaining relationships, hiring people from within the community, financially supporting members of the community for participating, having more interactive public involvement through focus groups and interactive games. And then also just really getting behind participatory budgeting and community-led analysis. So providing the resources for it, and then also just really listening to and valuing the results. I just realized I'm way over time because my clock started late. So I'll just wrap it up. Key takeaways are, hopefully this is some food for thought for how to push things further. I think that there is still room to grow in terms of how we run public processes to get us closer to transportation justice. And I have some links. I don't know if these slides will be shared, but if they are, I really recommend checking out the Untokening, which is a multiracial collective that centers on the lived experiences of marginalized communities to address mobility, justice, and equity. Those are in their words. But they have some really great resources about how to think about public processes and how to think about mobility justice. And then I'll leave it with my contact information. And I'm sorry for going over about my timer.
No problem. And just to answer that last question, yeah, we'll plan on posting the slides as long as all of our speakers are okay with that.
Great.
And thank you, Dr. Rosenveld. I think that was really a great framework for thinking about equitable decision-making processes. We're going to now hear a couple presentations thinking about safety and vehicle miles traveled reduction policies and outcomes within equity lens. So kind of moving from process to outcome. And so I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jesus Barajas, Assistant Professor of Environmental Science and Environmental Science and Policy from UC Davis. And Dr. Barajas, if you'd like to share your screen, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. All right, let's see if I can get into full screen mode here.
Your notes and timer are also, there you go.
Good?
Good.
Are the notes and timers still up now?
They are now, but they weren't just a second ago.
All right. How about now?
Still there.
Okay. Sorry about that. Let me. Right. All right, how are we doing now?
That looks good.
All right, thank you. And my apologies for that. Yes, my name is Jesus Barajas from UC Davis, and I appreciate the perspective that Dana gave us in the previous presentation, talking more about the processes, and kind of sort of that leads us to thinking about outcomes of transportation planning and processes. So I want to talk a little bit about safety, and I've called this talk Safe for Whom, Transportation Safety in the Context of Planning and Infrastructure Inequities. And this comes from some of my work, in addition to some of the work of collaborators and colleagues who I haven't worked with, thinking about the connections between transportation safety and equity. So I've kind of structured this around 3 lessons from this body of work, mostly focused on active transportation, so cycling and walking. And the first lesson, I think, is that we need to understand the transportation inequities, so the results of what we learned about this morning from Eric Avila's talk, and the history and then the processes that Dana just talked about that led to these inequities, mean that people experience streets differently. And so, we can look at safety as one of these differences, and what we know from the research is that people of color, people in poverty, are at much higher risk of being killed in a vehicle crash and for experiencing crashes in general. So when I did some work a few years ago looking at the San Francisco Bay Area that I'll talk about again in a moment, the stats were that Latinos were 2.5 times as likely to get into a bike crash, and Black cyclists were 8 times as likely to get into a crash compared to white cyclists. Some of the reasons for this, thinking about cycling, a lot of it comes down to the infrastructure, and you can see on the image here, this is focused on pedestrians, but the characteristics are similar for cyclists. And that, a lot of the streets in neighborhoods of color are really oriented around the automobile. So in this instance, crosswalk, you can't see a crosswalk in the image. You're trying to cross 5 or 6 lanes of traffic to get to the other side. There's no sidewalk. Traveling at night, there's often less lighting because of historic disinvestment in these neighborhoods. And I think on the pedestrian side, Angie Schmidt, who wrote recently for Streets Blog, has a book called Right of Way that talks about not just kind of the epidemic of pedestrian safety in the United States and how crashes and deaths have been increasing over the last decade, but how those are experienced in communities of color as well. So getting back to the statistics, this shows stats from the FARS database that documents fatalities throughout the United States. And it shows that Black, Indigenous, people of color are overrepresented in fatality statistics. So the way to read this chart is that the leftmost bar of the cluster shows the proportion of fatalities in that racial or ethnic group among all groups for vehicles on the left, pedestrians in the center, and bicycles on the right. And then the bars to the right of that show population, miles traveled, and trips taken. There's a proportion within that group of all groups. And basically, if the fatalities bar is above the other bars, then that group is overrepresented in the statistics. And you can see, especially for walking and cycling across the US, when we're looking at proportion of the population, when we're looking at miles traveled, when we're looking at the share of trips taken, especially for the Black population, they're well overrepresented in fatality statistics. And if we look in California, again, from the FARS database, the stats are similar here, where Black people are overrepresented in fatalities, and compared to the share of their population, the miles traveled and the trips taken. And we can look on the cycling side, significantly so for miles traveled and trips taken for the Latino population. So I did a little bit of work on this. Again, in 2016, I looked at the Switters database, which compiles the crash statistics for California, to look at sort of how the crashes were distributed across different population groups, and try to tie that to land use and infrastructure to see how those affected the rates of crashes. And what I found, again, similar to the fatality statistics I showed before, that Black cyclists were experienced crashes disproportionately. And when I looked at both land use and infrastructure, specifically the roadway classification, and whether or not there was bicycle infrastructure on the streets, I found that in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, there didn't seem to be an effect of infrastructure or traffic like there were in majority white neighborhoods. And so that kind of points to the fact that just installing a bike lane or just reducing the traffic speeds on a street or lowering traffic volumes might not have the same effect across all groups because of other mitigating factors. I think so that points to the idea that infrastructure is not the end all be all goal to get us to safer conditions. And it's important to understand how other social ecological factors, so how perceptions of streets and neighborhoods and how social identities and social networks might play a role in understanding traffic safety. And so this comes from work that I did in my dissertation finished in 2016 that looked at specifically among Latino immigrants, what were motivations for cycling, what were some of the barriers for cycling, and how did that intersect with safety. And what I found was that peer groups, families, and community-based organizations that the individuals might have been involved with really influenced how people saw streets and how they felt about safety. Some talked about their experiences with sort of cultural narratives affecting the way they perceived cycling. So one woman talked about the taboos that back in the 1800s, the taboos were about women shouldn't be riding horses. And so now that's sort of translated over to bicycles, I suppose, as the modern horse. And she was trying to fight against that narrative and trying to get some of her peers to think about cycling as a mode of transportation. Along with that, issues that Latino communities are, especially in the Bay Area and in San Francisco, where I was doing this work, gentrification was an ever-present concern in the back, or really at the front of their minds, and sort of the links of thinking about planning for cycling came along at the same time that that the significant neighborhood changes came along, and many of the interviewees were wondering why it was only now that, after so many years of advocating for safer infrastructure, for better cycling conditions, why now, only in the time of extreme gentrification, were these changes coming about. And some folks talked about how they felt excluded from cycling spaces because of these neighborhood changes. So those kind of identity and cultural factors really mattered in understanding how people felt and perceived cycling. The second thing I wanted to share is that safe doesn't always mean safe. And what I mean by that is it's important to recognize the distinction between traffic safety and personal security. And when we in the transportation world are talking about safety, we're often talking about that former concept, the traffic safety. But in reality, especially in lower income communities, communities of color, communities that experience high crime rates. It's that latter, it's that personal security that's really salient, or at least compounds issues of traffic safety. So work by Charles Brown and collaborators at Rutgers, Bob Schneider, who's now at UW Milwaukee, have looked into what some of these particular barriers and responses to threats are. And this crime and personal security comes to the top. Inadequate infrastructure is in there as well, but so are issues with racial profiling by the police in efforts that are trying to get safer streets that bring police enforcement into the center of these strategies. And I'll talk about a little bit about this in a moment. So what these barriers mean is that not all infrastructure really will benefit all groups in the same way. And so work that Ann Lusk out of Harvard University has done, she and her colleagues did in-depth focus groups with 200 people in the Boston area. And what they found was that there was a significant sort of difference in the narrative about what is effective as safe for cyclists, quiet streets, separated bike infrastructure, low speeds, low traffic. But what mattered for people from higher crime communities, from communities of color, was that they actually wanted to ride on very more high traffic streets, because that meant there were more eyes on the street from neighboring businesses, for example, and they felt safer, they felt less vulnerable to attack from violent crime. And so this kind of shows the difference, or why sort of paying attention to those identity issues matter when we're thinking about safety outcomes. And as we highlighted at the beginning of the webinar here, for Black people especially, this danger from police violence is something that's going to be really compound other safety issues. And so, over the summer, Dijon Kizzee in Los Angeles was killed after a bike stop. And the LA Times did an investigation and found that there were 15 similar shootings to the Dijon Kizzee shooting, and 11 of those individuals who had been stopped for riding a bike had been killed. So that was all about cycling. I've done some work that showed that crime is a key barrier to walking too. So when I worked for the Safe Transportation Research and Education Center at UC Berkeley, we did a series of workshops with communities that brought together both leadership from the communities, transportation agencies, public health agencies, and community residents and groups to talk about transportation safety, but also to help build capacity to apply for active transportation program grants that would help improve safety in the communities. And we did a series of surveys in those workshops and found that really the crime rates were significant barriers to walking across all of the communities that we worked in, both urban and rural, all of which were low resource communities. And so these topics kind of lead to the third lesson is that infrastructure inequities will compound other inequities. And so I started to talk about this already, but where I want to highlight this is in some of the work that I've been doing in the Chicago area with a community group called Equiticity that has a sort of vision for improving or enacting mobility justice in Chicago. And they've been longtime bike advocates, and now have sort of expanded their purview to looking at all modes of transportation. And where they've sort of stuck their stake in the ground is around Vision Zero. And so for those less familiar, Vision Zero is a strategy that's has been imported from Sweden from the late 1990s and brought to the US and expanded to 40-something cities around the country, which has a goal of achieving zero traffic deaths on the roadways. And it does this through kind of standard pillars of engineering, of education, of data analysis, of identifying high crash neighborhoods, corridors, places with lots of fatalities, to sort of develop a targeted plan to eliminate those deaths. And what we're finding from a lot of this data analysis, sort of unsurprising from what I've been talking about previously, is that a lot of these corridors and neighborhoods are in communities of color. But one of the central components of many of these Vision Zero plans is police engagement and police enforcement, and thinking about the legacy and the history of violence in communities of color at the hands of the police means that many advocacy groups, Equiticity among them, it really wants to rethink how policing is done in the context of these safety strategies. Some cities have taken steps. Portland and Los Angeles, for example, have explicitly acknowledged the racial bias in policing, but haven't yet gotten to the stage where they're removing police enforcement from their Vision Zero strategies. So, thinking about, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, thinking about whether policing is the right safety intervention. Again, looking specifically at cycling, there's some evidence that maybe we should be policing. We should be have some enforcement of bicycle laws, because there are some safety implications. So if cyclists, for example, are riding on the sidewalk, which they may do when there's no infrastructure available, it's still riskier than riding on the roadway because of the potential for conflicts across driveways and intersections and conflicts with pedestrians. It depends on the type of infrastructure the type of roadway that we're comparing it to. But in general, we find can be dangerous. But the problem is, of course, policing is also dangerous for cyclists of color. And if we look across lots of evidence from traffic stops specifically, we see that there are pervasive racial disparities when we examine who's being stopped and for what reasons, especially when we're looking at discretionary stops in which a cyclist for riding on the sidewalk might be stopped. Those are subject to potentially more bias in enforcement. So with Equiticity, we looked at bicycle citations in Chicago, which is why I've been talking a lot about cycling. And what we see are, again, just like in the traffic stops, we see evidence of extensive racial disparities in who is being stopped, who is being issued tickets. Black people make up 1/3 of the population in Chicago, but received over half of the citations, the bicycle citations. And when we connect infrastructure to where those citations are being issued, we see far fewer bike lanes in those circled areas, which is where most of the tickets were issued. Those areas also happen to be the majority Black and Latino neighborhoods in Chicago. If we look at the map on the right, we see this shows the number of bike injury crashes in the city. And we see, again, in both of those circled areas, far fewer bicycle injury crashes compared to other parts of the city, which don't match up with the rates of citations. And so this lack of infrastructure matters. So the majority of tickets given to bicyclists in Chicago, 90% of them are given for riding on the sidewalk, which again, people are likely to do when they don't feel safe on the roadways. And if we look at sort of across the different street types upon which cyclists were issued tickets, we see for arterial streets especially, once you put a bike lane on that arterial street, the likelihood of getting a ticket on that street decreased. In general, that incident rate was cut by about 30% with bicycle infrastructure on the street. But as we saw on the map previously, that infrastructure was disproportionately absent from communities of color. So, thinking about, all these lessons, what can planners and policymakers do? I know Caltrans is not necessarily involved in traffic enforcement as part of its responsibilities, but the thing that brings to mind is that Caltrans is in the business of thinking about infrastructure, and this lack of infrastructure compounds other inequities, especially in policing, and so it requires that investment. But as Dana was alluding to before, that work needs to happen in close collaboration with community members, especially thinking about sort of what the unintended consequences of investment of infrastructure are. And it also means that we really need to think about in our planning and policy how these differences, these intersections of identity and mobility intersect with transportation planning, because a street in one neighborhood is not necessarily the street in another neighborhood when we think about what the consequences of these differences are. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn it back to Mike to get us to our next speaker.
Great. Thanks so much, Jesus. That was great. I think really helpful to have that spotlight on some of the complex factors that influence those disparate safety statistics you showed us. And to me, I think clear takeaway is infrastructure, or I guess lack of infrastructure, clearly plays a key role, but it's not just infrastructure, right? And so we can maybe get into that a little bit more in the Q&A of how do you factor in some of those non-infrastructure factors in your decision making. So I want to turn it over to our final speaker for this session. Dr. Jean-Daniel Safforz is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Irvine, and he's going to present some work on voluntary versus involuntarily carless households, and give us some food for thought on thinking about those two very, very distinct groups as we're thinking about vehicle miles traveled reduction. So Jean-Daniel, I'll hand it over to you if you'd like to share your screen.
Thank you very much. So let me try to share my screen with you.
And while you're doing that, I'll just remind folks that you should feel free to put any questions you have for any of our speakers in the chat box. And you can also use your raise hand feature, and we can call on you if you want to ask your question or make a comment verbally. And that looks
Great.
good.
Thank you. And I want to commend the previous speakers for great presentations. I'm hoping we're going to have a spirited discussion among the many important issues that were discussed. So as you mentioned, I'd like to talk to you briefly about the difference between voluntarily carless and involuntarily carless households in California. It's a little bit of an unusual topic, partly because of a lack of data. But in recent years, there has been an increasing interest, especially from my colleagues at UCLA and from us at UC Irvine, for people without, not just people, households without motor vehicles, and how to understand who they are and to understand how they manage to live and hopefully thrive in California, which is quintessential car land, you could say. So this is joint work with my former PhD student, Shuman Mitra, who is currently an assistant professor in civil engineering at the University of Arkansas. Shuman has a planning background as well. And as you mentioned, I'm based in civil environmental engineering, but in fact, my PhD is in applied economics, and I also have a courtesy appointment in urban planning and public policy at UCI. So this is the outline of my presentation. First of all, I want to motivate why we are talking about carless households at a time when the emphasis is more on driverless vehicles. Well, the reason is pretty simple. It's related to the current problems and the increased awareness about the environmental impacts and the social justice implications of transportation in California, especially as they're related to automobiles. So first of all, let me highlight some of the problems of not having access to a motor vehicle in California. So if you live in especially Southern California, if you don't have a car, it's almost as if you were living in a high rise without a lift. Or to put it in another way, actually that my 13-year-old would understand even better, it's as if you had a smartphone without a data plan. So you cannot take advantage of much of what society has to offer in this area, starting with economic opportunities, access to healthcare, access to various amenities, and more generally, your social life. So to put things in perspective, there are roughly 1 million households in California who do not have a motor vehicle. Does not necessarily mean that they do not completely have access to one, but if they want to drive a car, they have to borrow one, or they have to rent a car. So one question we ask is it always bad to not have a car in California? Again, putting things in context, the context I'm coming from is global climate change, but also the environmental health impacts of transportation. A few years back, Pope Francis highlighted the need to tackle global climate change. In California, we've had a number of laws and regulations that were passed to take this into account to finally address this problem. As you're aware, there is this big push to make the transportation sector carbon neutral by 2045, and I am lucky to be involved in this project. And as a result, there has been a push to reduce vehicle miles traveled and auto dependency. Although it's kind of a tall order because especially in my part of California, we depend very much on cars to do almost everything. So we were interested, Shuman and I, into looking at how people without cars make it. And it's especially important to distinguish between people who voluntarily do not have a car. So we want to learn from them. So what kind of environment is needed in order to do that? But it's also even more important to understand who people who are not voluntarily without a car, who they are, and what plight they are facing on a daily basis, just for social justice, basic social justice. Okay, so that's our goal, essentially. The problem is why this has not received more attention before is essentially a data problem. We focus a lot in various travel surveys on people with cars, and so we know a fair amount about them. But typically we ignore people without cars, even though, as I mentioned in the previous slide, there are roughly 1 million households in California who do not have a car. Okay, so fortunately, the 2012 California Household Travel Survey had a question in there that is allowing us to study this problem. Okay, so again, to highlight the problems of not having a car, if it's not voluntary, you're at risk of physical isolation, poor access, limited access to jobs, and more generally social exclusion using the UK definition of social exclusion. So we are asking two questions. First of all, we want to find out the characteristics of voluntary and involuntarily carless households in California. So we want to contrast them. And two, we want to try to understand how their travel patterns differ. So how they differ between these two groups and how they are different from the rest of the population who has access to motor vehicles. So we had a look at the literature, but the literature was mostly about people who have cars, but still it was interesting. So for our analysis, we collected a lot of information. So a lot of this information was already available in the CHTS, but we also combined data from the CHTS with other data sets that we had access to. Fortunately, we had a full version of the CHTS, including the location of the respondents. I know it's very sensitive, but it's important for researchers in general to have access, maybe not exactly to where people live, but to have a good idea of where they live so we can model their environment, especially the built environment. So in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, we have a number of variables that characterize life stage, and then we have variables that look at where people live, so density, diversity, accessibility, transit availability. Okay, so we are combining these different variables together in different types of models. So the key question, our dependent variable, is a question in the CHTS that asked a respondent whether or not they were voluntarily without a car or not. The thing is, they asked for the way the question was structured, left open the possibility that for not knowing exactly if the decision to not have a car was voluntary or not voluntary, unfortunately. And so we had to do a little bit of work to organize respondents in three groups: people who are voluntarily carless, those who are not, and people for whom it was difficult to tell because they gave us reasons that could lead us to think that it was voluntary sometimes and not voluntary some other times. Okay, so these are examples of voluntary and involuntary carless people. By the way, the Schumann is a person sitting, waiting for transit. By the way, he finally broke down, passed his driver's license, and I'm glad to report that he has a car, but as I mentioned at the beginning, he moved to Arkansas for an academic job. So a quick overlook of our sample. So 15% of our carless households are voluntary, clearly based on all their answers. 42% are not voluntary, and the balance are, we don't know, okay? Of course, the overwhelming majority of CHTS respondents have a car, about 92%, as you can tell, but still we have a large enough sample to conduct a statistical analysis. So at the outset, we thought it would be interesting to kind of map where carless households live. And initially, we expected many of them to be in the Bay Area, which has BART and a great bus system and so on. But to our surprise, we found out that you can be carless in California, voluntarily so, in most of the state, at least in areas where you have a large enough population, typically. So we also have, as you can see from this map, a large population of voluntarily carless people in Southern California. So our analysis, we used two approaches: a univariate analysis and a multivariate analysis to understand the joint impact of various factors. So we used our univariate analysis to do a primary characterization of voluntarily carless versus involuntarily carless households. And we also used our univariate analysis to look at their travel behavior. And then we use multivariate analysis, just a series of 3 logit models to characterize them. Okay, so I'm not going to go more in depth. So one key aspect of this research was also to characterize land use. So that's why it's so critically important to have information about where people live. So we use various measures. This is a land use entropy, for example, and the map that represents the values that we calculated. Okay, so let's go through some of the results. You'll see some of them are not surprising and others are interesting, unexpected to some extent. So first of all, as expected, voluntarily carless households tend to have a higher household income and a higher level of education than households who are not voluntarily carless. Households who are voluntarily carless also tend to be smaller. They tend to have a smaller number of workers also than involuntarily carless households. They tend to live in single-family detached houses more as well. And most importantly, they tend to live in areas that are more diverse in the sense that you have more varied land uses and you also have more jobs in the proximity of these areas. Okay. So by contrast, people who are not voluntarily carless come from bigger families, have lower incomes, they have more children. Okay, so Hispanic Latino households are more likely to be carless in general. So our 3 models, I should have spent a little bit more time on them. So one contrasts carless and motorized households. The second one contrasts voluntarily carless and motorized households. And the third one contrasts voluntarily carless and involuntarily carless households. Okay, so a household is less likely to be carless when the number of workers is larger in the households. African Americans are more likely to be carless. Households where educational attainment is low are much more likely to be carless. And families with 1 child are more likely to be voluntarily carless. Okay, so household structure, education, income, all are important. So let's talk a little bit about the built environment. So dwelling type is important. Households in general who live in single-family housing are less likely to be carless. Okay, so you tend to find voluntarily carless households in denser areas, more like in your downtown areas typically. And most built environment variables are statistically significant for all 3 of our models. I want to highlight that we probably could have done a better job still at characterizing the environment in which people live. It's just that data are not necessarily easily available, unfortunately. So I would like to make a pitch for our friends at Caltrans to help researchers, gather data that can be used in models that can shed some light on these questions. So land use entropy is also important. So higher land use entropy is associated with a higher likelihood of being carless. So more diversity, more jobs, more shops, more restaurants, and so on, not just areas where people can live. And access to transit is paramount, is critical. It helps people get around. Okay, but we'll see that, in fact, involuntarily carless households depend more on transit, and that is causing some problems for them. So let's look at travel characteristics. So I'm going to look at 3 facets of travel. I'm going to look at trip distance, trip duration, and I'm going to look at mode. So let's start by looking at the first chart in the top right corner. And we see it shows that motorized households, unsurprisingly, drive more. They travel more for various trip purposes, right? They travel more for work, for shopping, for personal business, and so on. Interestingly enough, voluntarily carless households travel less than all three of them, except for school and after school. And one reason for that is that they live in an environment that they picked. So it's in an environment typically that has, maybe shops nearby, maybe that's convenient for going to work, and that offers amenities and enables them to have a rich social life. Okay. Involuntarily carless households travel significantly more than voluntarily carless households by so 1.63 miles. That's the I think the median trip distance for involuntarily carless households versus only 1.29 miles for voluntarily carless households. Okay. Involuntarily carless households typically have to go farther for work and for various activities. So motorized households obviously have a higher percentage of longer trips than carless households, just the value of mobility that's coming from having access to a motor vehicle. So we have more information in the paper and in the graph at the top, at the bottom right corner. So let's talk briefly about trip duration, starting with the top right chart. And that one shows us, and that's the important part, that it takes longer for involuntarily carless households to travel to where they want to go. It takes them more time to go to work, even compared to motorized households, to go to school, to do recreational and social and civic or religious activities, actually much more. Personal business also takes considerably more time, and so does shopping. So it's not so much distance that counts, of course, it's more time, right? Because we know that motorized households travel longer distances, but in fact, it takes them less time to do what they want to do. And interestingly enough, for voluntarily carless households, in a number of cases, for a number of activities, it doesn't take them much longer than motorized households. It's just, again, they pick their environment. It's an environment in which they can do what they want to do. Okay, so trip durations are shortest for motorized households, and in many cases, they're as short for voluntarily carless households. Okay, then we also looked at the frequency of various trip durations. So that's reflected on the figure at the bottom right corner of your screen. So we can see that voluntarily carless households have more short trips, up to 10 minutes, than involuntarily carless households, but not as high as motorized households. And that just, the reason is just that people with cars tend to drive everywhere, even if they could actually walk. It's just we have become slaves of our vehicles, unfortunately, and that, as we know, has impacts on our health in general. So we have more detailed information on this chart, and it's in the paper as well. And then the third facet of travel is mode. So compared to carless households, motorized households rely almost exclusively on their vehicles for almost 90% of their trips, so 88% according to our results. And much less on walking and biking, less than 10%, and they almost do not rely at all on public transit. It's completely the opposite for involuntarily carless households. They rely much more on transit, but they also walk less and bike less than voluntarily carless households. So if you don't have a car but wanted one, you tend to rely more on transit, which explains why it takes you longer to go places, because you have to wait, you have to connect, and so on. But unfortunately, you walk and bike less than people who don't have a car by choice. Okay, so there are also health implications from these travel choices, or in this case, constrained choices. Of course, trip distance comes into play. Since voluntarily carless households take a lot of short trips, it's easier for them to walk or bike. Okay, so and then another fact that we found interesting looking at occupancy is that typically motorized households, when they are in their motor vehicle, they are by themselves in more than 50%, or in roughly 50% of their trips. And you have, as expected, a higher occupancy for carless households when they do use an automobile or drive with someone. And occupancy is highest for involuntary carless households because they don't have a choice, right? They have to go when it's possible to go. And so the vehicles that they use when they use one, or when they are passengers, tend to have a higher number of occupancy. So in summary, so it's very important to distinguish between voluntarily carless and involuntarily carless households. They are two distinct groups. Voluntarily carless households have higher income, more education typically. Their household size is smaller. They have fewer children. And most importantly, they pick their environment. Okay, and that has substantial implications for the way they travel. Their trips tend to be shorter, and they tend to be closer to where they want to go for what they want to do. Conversely, involuntary carless households come from larger families. They tend to be poorer. They have a less education. They also have fewer opportunities. They depend more on transit. They walk less, potentially because they are in environments where walking and biking are more dangerous. The last presentation by Jesus was great for that. So it's really important to look at these facets to make it easier for them to be more mobile and to have access to more opportunities. Again, transportation is key to having access to better jobs, having access to healthcare, and to your social life as well. So density is very important. Quality of life is important as well. And that's something we need to work on. It's going to take some time. In the short term, of course, there's a temptation to say that in order to improve the mobility of involuntarily carless households, maybe the state could consider subsidizing the purchase of the access to motor vehicles, but this comes with a number of substantial drawbacks. And so we may want to look at maybe better access to transit, access to micromobility, and if policies are put in place to improve access to motor vehicles, it should be zero emission vehicles. Thank you. Any questions or suggestions? I also provided a list of papers. So as you can see, so Schumann and I have been working on this for several years. I want to acknowledge my colleagues at UCLA who also have been working on this for several years. So interesting readings if you have the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jean-Daniel. Yeah, I think that dichotomy presented really just hit home to me. I think, as we're considering policies to reduce VMT and encourage active travel and other modes, it's going to be a lot easier for some people than others to drive less just because of infrastructure, land use patterns. Back again to that theme of the importance of infrastructure and how much infrastructure or lack of it can really can affect people in disparate ways. So a good example of the importance of considering how policies might affect people in different ways. So we've got a few minutes for Q&A for all of our panelists now. Once again, please use the chat box if you'd like to enter in some questions, and I see a couple are just coming in. So there's a question, and this is maybe for Jean-Daniel and Jesus. I give you a chance to weigh in on this too, but question about the degree to which bike safety factors into the decision for people to opt out of having a car, whether, kind of that question of infrastructure, whether they live in a place of bike lanes or bike paths or safe bicycle infrastructure. And John Danielle, I don't think your analysis kind of got down to that level, but maybe you could comment more generally on just the importance of some of those factors. And then Jesus, if you want to weigh in on that too.
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, we don't know enough. I mean, the CHTS is designed to answer many questions, but most of all to shed some light on travel trends. So there are tons of questions, but we always want more. I would love to know more about people's decisions. So why they decided to not have a motor vehicle. Unfortunately, I want to highlight that there is no such question in the 2017 NHTS, right? So it's just a one-off in a way. We were very fortunate that there was this one question in the 2012 CHTS. I think to answer this question in more depth, we need a regional survey. So maybe Jesus has some idea or is aware of a data set that would enable us to answer the question that we were asked.
Yeah, there's nothing on the scale of a regional data set that would answer this question. I think but folks have done surveys that have kind of looked at, how safety factors into decision making around that. And I think, thinking about differences between voluntary and involuntarily carless households, if you opt out of having a car, if you are voluntarily carless, I mean, you have the privilege of allowing bike safety and your perceptions of bike safety to dictate whether or not you opt out. So, your perceptions of safety are a very critical component of mode choice, especially when it comes to cycling. And so, you may have the privilege to move somewhere where safety is better, or you may have the power to advocate for safer conditions. And so, sort of speaking generally, I think that's an important factor, although, I don't have a sort of empirical evidence off the top of my head to answer that in that way.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think people who would be concerned about walking and biking would be very unlikely to give away their cars and move to an area. So we don't know for sure, but as Jesus said, it's very likely that people who voluntarily do not have cars pick areas that are safer for walking and biking.
Great. So question for Dana. Do you have advice for staff who maybe feel unsure of how to kind of go beyond what's legally required in terms of public engagement, and how to kind of take that next step and start bringing in kind of new methods of working with communities to make decisions on some of these projects?
Yeah, I mean, I can try to answer that. I think there's a lot that can be done within existing frameworks. And so I sort of alluded to that in the slide about advanced public participation practices. But I really think that kind of shift, it takes a long time. It takes building relationships. And it really, at the end of the day, a lot of the things that I am suggesting really, it would be great if they, that the agency is supportive but isn't leading, that it sort of comes from the community. So I think that in any given situation, it would just be important to have those relationships, to establish those relationships with community-based organizations, and to really listen to what they're saying about how they'd like to see the process go. And it may be that they've got a lot of ideas about how they want to change things, and that can be a more powerful way to set that direction.
Thanks. So we got another question. Maybe I'll open this up to all three of you in terms of recommendations for quantitative criteria or metrics that maybe aren't being used that should be used for evaluating transportation projects in terms of equity or kind of maybe identifying identifying disparate impacts. And I'll preface by saying, I think we'll be having some discussion around this question during the next session as well. But it'd be great to get the researchers' thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So my former graduate student, Augustina Kopp, and the Metropolitan Planning Council out of Chicago, nonprofit transportation research organization. And I looked at this question, at least with respect to how MPOs are doing equity-driven performance and performance metrics and decision-making criteria. And I think sort of what we identified as some of the most promising ways to go forward, and other scholars have talked about this for a long time, is really looking at individual measures of accessibility. So we were looking specifically at how in regional transportation plans and in the TIPS, the short-term transportation planning project list, how the MPOs were making their decisions and to what extent equity was factoring into those. And most of the criteria were, the equity-based criteria were focused on, okay, which community has, which neighborhood, community, census tract, whatever, has access to, let's say, a new rail line or a new bike lane or a new roadway, and sort of looking at the demographic characteristics therein. But the more successful ones were looking at not just where they were placed, but how that enhanced access to jobs, to schools, to healthcare, and so on. And not just looking at the specific geography, but using travel demand models, the outputs from the travel demand models to analyze the distribution across the population. There's only a few, I think Chicago was one that was doing that. MTC in the Bay Area is their next update of their regional transportation plan is doing that. But I think that's the direction that a lot of equity-minded scholars who are thinking about these questions would push at least MPOs to move in that direction.
If I could just add to that.
Next? Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. Thanks. I would echo what Jesus is saying about accessibility, and I'll just mention I'm working with some colleagues on an NCHRP project to provide guidance on accessibility measurement that could be useful for that. It'll probably be out in a year or two, though. But there are some other resources out there to think about that. And then I would just add that it's hard to provide like a one-size-fits-all answer to that, because so much is situation specific. And so I think it's just really important to make sure that whatever the measures are, that they reflect the concerns of the community and the sort of the truth that people experience on the ground in order to get buy-in and in order to actually address the concerns that people have. So in the example I gave where, they were thinking about a different type of community than we usually look at race and income, but they were looking at, political power, whether it was an unincorporated community, and that changed the equation on how the metrics looked.
So, I believe in quantitative analysis, and often when we want to conduct an analysis, we run into problems with not being able to merge different data sets. I mean, when you talk about environmental justice or uneven access to transportation, I think it's really important to have data about housing, the location of various amenities, the location of hospitals, community clinics, restaurants. I mean, it's also very important to have data about costs. I really think generalized costs are important, and often they are very difficult to calculate. And then we also need things that may not always be easy to measure, or data that are not always easily to combine with transportation data, so data about crime, data about perception, service quality, and so on. So I would like to see more comprehensive data sets and more access for at least UC researchers to these data sets. I mean, I know there are privacy issues, but I think it's totally possible to navigate these privacy issues, privacy concerns, but at the same time to have the comprehensive data sets that we need to answer these questions.
Great. Well, I really like to thank our three presenters for giving us a lot of food for thought. I think some or all of you may be participating in our breakout sessions next as well. So we can keep the discussion going. So we've been talking at you all for quite a while now. So we're going to take a quick break and then give all of our participants a chance to talk. So hopefully the ideas from this morning can swirl around in our heads a bit and inform our discussions around 4 key questions that we're going to introduce after the break, and we'll break out into some breakout sessions. So we're running a few minutes behind. We're going to come back at 11:35, and we'll do a quick introduction together with all of us in one group, and then we're going to split out into our breakouts, our facilitated breakout sessions. So see you all at 11:35. Thanks.